Her twin babies were freezing to death in the snow until a Yakama chief wrapped them in his war blanket. What happened next would shatter everything Miriam Stone thought she knew about enemies, survival, and the true meaning of humanity in the unforgiving wilderness of the Washington Territory. The winter of 1858 came early to the Cascade Mountains, descending like a wolf pack on territory that had never seen such brutal cold.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Miriam Stone pressed her horse forward through the deepening drifts, her arms wrapped around two small bundles that held her entire world. Lucy and Samuel, barely 8 months old, had stopped crying an hour ago. That silence terrified her more than their earlier wails ever could. The twins were dying. She could feel it in the way their tiny bodies had gone still against her chest, in the shallow whisper of their breathing that seemed to fade with each gust of wind that cut through the mountain pass like a razor blade. Her mare stumbled beneath her, exhausted from fighting through snow that now reached the animal's belly. Steam rose from the horse's flanks in ghostly spirals, but even that was beginning to fade as the animal's strength gave out. Miriam's husband, Benjamin, should have been here, should have been riding beside her, sharing the burden of carrying their children to safety. Instead, he lay buried beneath 6 feet of earth, back in the ruins of their homestead, along with 4 other families who had thought they could wait out the early winter before making the journey to Fort Walla Walla. The Cayuse Raiders had come at dawn, not for conquest but for survival, driven from their own lands by the same harsh winter that now threatened to claim her children. The attack had been swift and brutal, but Benjamin had bought her enough time to escape with the babies. Now, 3 days later, she was lost in a wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction, with no shelter, no food, and children who were slipping away from her with each passing moment. The map Benjamin had drawn for her was useless now, the landmarks buried under snow, the trails obliterated by the storm that had been raging since yesterday morning. She had been heading southeast toward the Columbia River, toward the safety of the military fort, but the blizzard had turned the world into a white maze where direction meant nothing and every ridge looked the same as the last. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. Ice crystals had formed in her eyelashes, making it difficult to see clearly. Her fingers, wrapped around the reins, had long since lost feeling, and she wondered dimly if she would even be able to hold on to the twins if her horse stumbled again. The leather reins cut into her palms like wire, and she could taste blood in her mouth from where she had bitten her tongue to keep from crying out in despair. The wind picked up again, howling through the pine trees with a sound like the screams of the damned. Snow whipped around them in spirals, stinging her face and finding its way into every gap in her clothing. Her wool coat, thick enough for Oregon winters, was no match for this mountain fury. The cold seeped through the fabric like water through a sieve, settling into her bones until she felt as brittle as winter branches. Lucy stirred slightly in her arms, a movement so faint Miriam almost missed it. She pulled the blanket tighter around both babies, trying to share what little warmth her body still generated. But she knew it wasn't enough. The blanket, woven from good wool and decorated with small yellow roses that had once seemed so cheerful in their cabin, was now stiff with ice and offered little protection against the killing cold. She had been foolish to attempt this journey alone, she knew that now. Benjamin had always been the navigator, the one who could read the landscape like a book and find his way through country that looked identical to her untrained eyes. She had insisted on coming west from Missouri, despite her father's warnings, drawn by Benjamin's dreams of timberland and a new life away from the crowded settlements. Now those dreams lay buried with her husband, and she was paying the price for her stubborn independence. The trail she had been following, barely more than a deer path through the forest, had disappeared completely under the snow. Her horse picked its way carefully between fallen logs and hidden rocks, each step a gamble that could send them all tumbling into a ravine. The animal's breathing was labored, coming in sharp puffs that crystallized in the frigid air. How much longer could the mare continue? How much longer before they all simply stopped moving and let the cold claim them? Miriam tried to remember the last time she had felt truly warm. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been only this morning when she had built a small fire with the last of her dry wood and melted snow to give the babies a few drops of warm water. The memory of that brief respite from the cold now felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else in a different world. The sound of her horse's hooves on the frozen ground was muffled by the snow, creating an eerie silence broken only by the constant moan of wind through the trees. Occasionally, she heard other sounds, the crack of a branch under the weight of ice, the distant howl of a wolf, the ominous rumble that might have been an avalanche somewhere higher in the mountains. Each sound made her jump, made her hold. The babies closer made her realize how completely alone they were in this vast wilderness. She thought of her sister back in Missouri, probably sitting by a warm hearth with her own children, safe and secure in a world that seemed impossibly far away now. Margaret had begged her not to make this journey, had warned her that the frontier was no place for a woman with small children. Wait until they're older, Margaret had pleaded. Wait until the Indian troubles settle down. But Benjamin had been eager to claim their land before other settlers arrived, and Miriam had trusted his judgment. Now she wondered if Margaret was watching her own babies crawl across her kitchen floor while Miriam was fighting for their lives in a frozen hell. The twins had been born during the harsh winter of their first year in the territory, when the closest doctor was 3 days' ride away, and Miriam had only the help of an elderly German woman from a neighboring homestead. They had been small from the start, but they were fighters, both of them, and they had grown strong and healthy through the spring and summer. Lucy with her bright blue eyes and wispy blonde hair, Samuel with his more serious expression and darker coloring that reminded everyone of his father. Now their tiny faces were pale as porcelain, their lips tinged with the blue that she knew meant death was coming for them. She tried to sing to them, the way she had when they were colicky infants, but her voice came out as little more than a croak. The cold had dried her throat until swallowing was painful, and the words of the lullabies seemed to freeze in the air before they could reach the baby's ears. Still, she hummed what she could, hoping that some part of them could still hear her, could still feel the love she was pouring out into the hostile wilderness. The horse stumbled again, more seriously this time, going down on one knee before struggling back to its feet. Miriam felt a surge of panic as she almost lost her grip on the twins. The mare's breathing was becoming more labored, and foam was beginning to appear around her bit. The animal was near exhaustion, pushed beyond its limits by the deep snow and bitter cold. Soon, very soon, the horse would simply lie down and refuse to get up again. And then what? Miriam looked around at the endless forest, the towering peaks that surrounded them on all sides, the snow that continued to fall with relentless persistence. She could try to walk, carrying the babies, but she knew she wouldn't get far. Her strength was nearly gone, sapped by 3 days of fear and cold and the constant effort of trying to keep her children alive. Without the horse, they would all die within hours. The thought of her babies dying in this terrible place, their small bodies lost in the snow until spring revealed their frozen forms to some passing trapper, filled her with a rage that temporarily warmed her blood. They deserved better than this. They deserved to grow up, to run and play and laugh, to live the long, full lives that every parent dreams of for their children. She had failed them by coming to this place, by not listening to the warnings, by not being strong enough or smart enough to keep them safe. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, something deep inside refused to give up. These were her children, her blood, her heart walking around outside her body. As long as she drew breath, she would fight for
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Them. She would carry them if the horse died. She would crawl through the snow if her legs gave out. She would tear the bark from trees with her bare hands if she had to. Anything to build a shelter, start a fire, buy them a few more hours of life. The wind died down for a moment, and in the sudden stillness, she heard something that made her heart stop. Hoofbeats, not the labored plodding of her own dying horse, but the steady rhythm of a strong animal moving with purpose through the snow. Someone else was out here in this wilderness, someone who knew these trails well enough to travel in weather that had nearly killed her. Hope and terror warred in her chest. It could be a rescue party from the fort, soldiers who had somehow tracked her through the storm. Or it could be the same raiders who had killed her husband, come to finish what they had started. In her current state, weakened and nearly defenseless, she would be easy prey for anyone with ill intentions. But as the sound grew closer, she realized she had no choice but to face whatever was coming. Her horse could go no further, and the babies would not survive another hour in this cold. Whether salvation or death was approaching through the trees. At least the waiting would soon be over. The hoofbeats stopped somewhere close by, though she could see nothing through the swirling snow and dense forest. Then she heard a voice, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, followed by the sound of someone dismounting. Footsteps crunched through the snow, coming in her direction with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Miriam clutched the babies closer to her chest and tried to prepare herself for whatever was about to emerge from the white curtain that surrounded her. Her hand moved instinctively to the small pistol Benjamin had insisted she carry, though she doubted her frozen fingers could work the trigger even if she needed to. The footsteps were very close now, and she held her breath, waiting to see whether death or deliverance was walking toward her through the storm. Through the swirling snow, a figure began to materialize like something from a dream or nightmare. Tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy grace of someone completely at home in this hostile environment. As he drew closer, she could make out more details that made her blood run cold. Dark skin, long black hair braided with feathers, and beads, clothing made from animal hides and decorated with intricate patterns. This was no soldier from the fort, no fellow settler who might offer help without question. This was a Yakama warrior, one of the very people she had been taught to fear since arriving in the territory. The same people who had been fighting a bitter war with the territorial government, who had been blamed for attacks on settlements, who were said to show no mercy to white women and children. And now one of them had found her, alone and helpless in the wilderness with her dying babies. The warrior stopped a few paces away, studying her with dark eyes that revealed nothing of his intentions. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps. In his 30s, with a face that might have been carved from stone. He wore no war paint that she could see, but that didn't make him any less dangerous. A tomahawk hung from his belt, along with a knife that looked capable of skinning a buffalo. His horse, a magnificent painted stallion, stood quietly behind him, apparently unaffected by the cold that was killing her own mount. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the snow-filled space between them. Miriam's mind raced with possibilities, all of them terrifying. Would he kill her quickly, or would he take her captive? What would he do to the babies? She had heard stories, whispered around settlement fires, of what happened to white children taken by the tribes. Some said they were raised as Indians. Others claimed they were used as slaves or worse. But as the seconds ticked by and the warrior made no aggressive moves, Miriam began to notice things that didn't fit with the savage image she had been taught to expect. His clothing, while made from animal skins, was beautifully crafted, with intricate beadwork and decorations that spoke of skill and artistry. His weapons, while deadly, were well maintained and properly secured, not brandished threateningly. Most importantly, his eyes, when they moved to the bundles in her arms, seemed to show something that looked almost like concern. The warrior spoke again, his voice low and melodious, in words she couldn't understand. When she didn't respond, he switched to broken English, his accent thick but his meaning clear enough. "Babies," he said, pointing to the bundles in her arms. "Cold, die soon." The blunt assessment hit her like a physical blow, though she knew. He was only stating what she already feared. Lucy and Samuel were indeed dying, their tiny bodies unable to generate enough heat to survive in this brutal cold. She looked down at their pale faces, at the blue tinge around their lips, and felt tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "help them. I don't care what happens to me, but please help my babies." The warrior tilted his head, studying her with those unreadable dark eyes. Then, to her amazement, he began to unfasten something from his shoulders. It was a blanket, but unlike any blanket she had ever seen. Made from buffalo hide and decorated with elaborate patterns in red, blue, and yellow, it seemed to radiate warmth even in the frigid air. This wasn't just any blanket. The intricate designs and the reverent way he handled it told her this was something special, something sacred. "War blanket," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "Chief's blanket. Many battles, much power." Before she could protest or ask what he meant, he stepped closer and began to wrap the magnificent blanket around her and the babies. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming, like being enveloped in sunlight after hours of bitter cold. The hide was thick and supple, lined with soft fur that felt like heaven against her frozen skin. But more than the physical warmth, there was something else, something she couldn't quite define but could definitely feel. A sense of strength, of protection, of ancient power that seemed to flow from the blanket itself. "You are chief?" she asked, looking up at him with new understanding. He nodded once, his expression still unreadable. "Kamiakin, chief of Yakama. You are lost." It wasn't a question, and Miriam nodded, suddenly feeling foolish for her earlier terror. This man, this chief, had seen her distress and had immediately moved to help, wrapping her children in what was clearly one of his most precious possessions. The war blanket of a Yakama chief, given freely to save the lives of white babies whose father had probably fought against his people. "My babies," she said, looking down at Lucy and Samuel, who were already beginning to stir as warmth returned to their tiny bodies. They were dying. "Not die now," Kamiakin said with quiet confidence. "Blanket have strong medicine. Keep them warm until we reach shelter." "We?" Miriam looked at him in confusion. "You're going to help us?" "Children need help," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Does not matter what color skin. Life is life." He moved to her exhausted horse, examining the animal with the practiced eye of someone who understood horses better than most people understood each other. After a moment, he shook his head grimly. "Horse not make it much further. We go to my lodge, not far." Before she could protest or ask questions, he was lifting her down from the saddle with surprising gentleness, careful not to disturb the babies wrapped in his war blanket. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet touched the ground, weak from hours of riding through the cold, but Kamiakin steadied her with a strong hand on her arm. "Can walk?" he asked. Miriam tested her legs, found them shaky but functional. "I think so." "Good, not far, but snow is deep. Must go slow." He led his painted stallion over to them, and Miriam saw that the animal was everything her poor Mare was not. Strong, well-fed, with the kind of endurance that came from years of life in harsh country. The horse stood quietly as Kamiakin helped. Her mount, still carrying the babies in their cocoon of warmth, as they began to move through the forest. Miriam found herself studying the man who had so unexpectedly become her savior. Everything she had been told about the Yakama, about all the tribes in the territory, seemed to crumble in the face of this reality. Here was a chief, a war leader, who had seen strangers in distress and had immediately offered help. Not just any help, but the gift of his most sacred possession and the promise of shelter. The war blanket continued to work its magic, and she could feel the babies growing warmer and stronger with each passing minute. Lucy opened her eyes and looked around, with curiosity instead of the glassy stare of hypothermia. Samuel made a small sound, not quite a cry, but definitely a sign of returning life. They were going to survive, she realized with a rush of gratitude so intense it brought fresh tears to her eyes. But as they moved deeper into Yakama territory, following trails that existed only in Kamiakin's memory, Miriam began to wonder what would happen next. She was a white woman, alone with her children, completely dependent on the kindness of a people she had been taught to fear. Would his tribe accept her presence? Would they see her as a threat, a spy, an enemy to be eliminated? And what would happen when the authorities at Fort Walla Walla realized she was missing? Would they send search parties into Yakama lands, potentially starting a conflict that could cost many lives? These questions swirled through her mind as they traveled, but each time she looked down at her babies, warm and safe in the chief's war blanket, she pushed the worries aside. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Kamiakin had saved their lives when no one else could. That debt, she knew, would bind her fate to his in ways she was only beginning to understand. The snow continued to fall, but wrapped in the war blanket and mounted on the chief's strong horse, Miriam no longer felt like she was fighting a losing battle against the wilderness. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope that they might all live to see another sunrise. And as the forest closed around them, leading them deeper into a world she never could have imagined, she realized that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places, wearing faces that the world had taught her to fear, but her heart was learning to trust. The journey to Kamiakin's lodge took them through a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Ancient cedar trees towered overhead like cathedral spires, their massive trunks scarred by centuries of storms and their branches heavy with snow that fell in soft whispers whenever the wind stirred. The trail they followed was invisible to Miriam's eyes, but Kamiakin moved with the confidence of a man who could navigate these mountains blindfolded, reading signs in bent branches and disturbed snow that told him stories she couldn't even imagine. As they rode deeper into Yakama territory, Miriam found herself studying the man who had become her unlikely savior. Kamiakin sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had been born in the saddle, his body moving in perfect harmony with his mount's gait. Despite the bitter cold that had nearly killed her, he seemed completely unaffected by the weather, as if he carried some internal fire that kept him warm no matter what the elements threw at him. When he spoke, which was rarely, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. The war blanket continued to work its mysterious magic around her and the babies. What had started as simple physical warmth had become something more profound, a sense of protection that seemed to emanate from the very fibers of the buffalo hide. The intricate patterns woven into the blanket told stories she couldn't read but somehow understood on a deeper level, tales of battles fought and won, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, of a people who had survived against impossible circumstances. She could feel the twins growing stronger with each mile they traveled, their breathing becoming more regular, their color returning to a healthy pink. Lucy stirred in her arms and opened her bright blue eyes, focusing on Miriam's face with the kind of intense concentration that babies reserved for their mothers. For the first time in days, her daughter smiled, a tiny expression of pure joy that made Miriam's heart leap with relief. Samuel, not to be outdone, made a small cooing sound and reached up with one tiny fist, as if trying to grab the snowflakes that danced around them. They were alive, truly alive, and getting stronger by the moment. "Your children are warriors," Kamiakin said, glancing back at them with something that might have been approval. "They fight death and win, good medicine." "They're fighters, all right," Miriam agreed, surprised by how natural it felt to be talking to this man she had feared just hours ago. They've had to be living out here. All children who survive this land are fighters, Kamiakin replied. White Indian makes no difference. The mountains do not care about skin color when they test you. The simple truth of his words struck her with unexpected force. Out here, in this vast wilderness where nature ruled with an iron fist, the differences that seemed so important in the settlements meant nothing. Cold was cold, hunger was hunger, and death was death, regardless of who you were or where you came from. Survival was the great equalizer, stripping away all pretense and revealing what people were truly made of. They came to a clearing where the snow had drifted deep against a line of rocky outcroppings, and Kamiakin brought his horse to a stop. To Miriam's eyes, there was nothing here but more wilderness, but the chief dismounted and walked to what appeared to be a solid wall of stone. He placed his hand against the rock and pushed, and to her amazement, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden entrance. Sacred place, he explained, helping her down from the horse. Known only to chiefs and elders. Safe from enemies, warm from earth's fire. As they stepped through the entrance, Miriam gasped in wonder. The space beyond was not a cave, as she had expected, but a sophisticated lodge built into the natural rock formation. The walls were lined with carefully fitted stones, and the ceiling was supported by massive cedar beams that must have taken dozens of men to move into place. But most impressive of all was the warmth, a gentle, enveloping heat that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. Hot springs, Kamiakin explained, seeing her amazement. Sacred waters that never freeze, even in hardest winter. My people have used this place for ceremonies and healing for many generations. The lodge was divided into several chambers, each serving a different purpose. The main room was dominated by a fire pit surrounded by comfortable seating areas covered in furs and woven blankets. Steam rose from pools of crystal-clear water that bubbled up from underground springs, filling the air with a mineral-rich moisture that felt like medicine on Miriam's parched throat and cracked lips. The walls were decorated with paintings that depicted the history of the Yakama people hunting scenes, battles, spiritual ceremonies, and portraits of great chiefs from ages past. In one corner of the main chamber sat an elderly woman, her silver hair braided with beads and feathers, her weathered hands working on a piece of intricate beadwork. She looked up as they entered, her dark eyes taking in every detail of Miriam's appearance before settling on the babies wrapped in Kamiakin's war blanket. When she spoke, it was in rapid Yakama, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. My grandmother, Kamiakin explained. She is called Singing Crow. She says the spirits told her we were coming. Singing Crow rose from her seat with surprising grace for someone who must have been well into her 70s. She approached Miriam with the confident stride of a woman who had delivered hundreds of babies and knew exactly what to do in any situation involving children. Without asking permission, she gently took Lucy from Miriam's arms and began unwrapping the war blanket to examine the baby. Her touch was firm but gentle, checking the infant's breathing, looking into her eyes, feeling for signs of frostbite or other cold-related injuries. She spoke to Kamiakin in their native language, her tone serious but not alarmed. Then she did the same examination with Samuel, her experienced hands finding things that a white doctor might have missed. She says they are strong, Kamiakin translated. Cold touched them, but did not claim them. The war blanket protected them from worst of it. They will live and grow strong. Tears of relief streamed down Miriam's face as she heard the confirmation of what she had been hoping but hadn't dared to believe. Her babies were going to be all right. They had survived the worst that the mountain winter could throw at them, and they were going to live to see another spring. Singing Crow spoke again, this time gesturing toward one of the other chambers. Kamiakin nodded and turned to Miriam. She says you must rest and eat. You are exhausted, and your body needs strength to care for the babies. She will prepare food and medicine." "I don't want to impose," Miriam began, but Kamiakin cut her off. With a gesture, "You are guest in sacred place. To refuse hospitality would be insult to the spirits. Besides," he added with what might have been the hint of a smile, "Singing Crow does not take no for answer." The elderly woman was already bustling around the lodge, gathering supplies and muttering instructions in Yakama that Kamiakin dutifully translated. She prepared a meal of roasted venison, wild rice, and dried berries, along with a tea made from herbs that Miriam didn't recognize, but that warmed her from the inside out. The food was simple but delicious, and Miriam realized she hadn't eaten a proper meal since the attack on their homestead 3 days ago. As she ate, Singing Crow prepared a place for the babies to sleep near one of the warm springs. She created a nest of soft furs and blankets, carefully positioned to catch the gentle warmth rising from the water without being too close to present any danger. When she was satisfied with the arrangement, she took both babies and settled them in their new bed, singing a lullaby in Yakama that seemed to weave itself around them like a protective spell. Lucy and Samuel, warm and fed and finally safe, fell into the deep, peaceful sleep of healthy infants. Their breathing was regular and strong, their color good, and Miriam felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time since Benjamin's death, she allowed herself to truly relax, to let down the guard she had maintained through sheer force of will. But as the immediate crisis passed, other concerns began to surface. She was a white woman in the heart of Yakama territory, completely dependent on the kindness of people she had been taught to consider enemies. The territorial government had been fighting a sporadic war with the Yakama for years, and tensions were high on both sides. What would happen when other members of Kamiakin's tribe discovered her presence? Would they see her as a threat, a spy, or worse? As if reading her thoughts, Kamiakin sat down across from her by the fire. "You are worried," he observed. "Shouldn't I be?" Miriam asked. "I'm grateful for what you've done, more grateful than I can ever express. But I know there's bad blood between our peoples. I've heard stories told by frightened people who do not understand," Kamiakin said dismissively. "Yes, there has been fighting. Yes, there is anger on both sides. But you are not a soldier, and your babies are not weapons. You are a mother protecting her children, just as any Yakama mother would do. But your people," Miriam pressed, "won't they object to having a white woman in their sacred place?" Kamiakin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of deep sadness. "My people have suffered much at the hands of white settlers," he said finally. "Our lands have been taken, our way of life threatened, our young men killed in battles that never needed to be fought. There's much anger, much pain. Some of my warriors would see you as an enemy, it is true." Miriam's heart sank, but Kamiakin wasn't finished. "But I am chief, and I say who is welcome in sacred places. I say that any mother who fights to save her children, who chooses love over fear, who looks beyond skin color to see the humanity in others, is welcome among the Yakama." His words were spoken with such quiet conviction that Miriam felt something shift inside her chest. This man, this chief who could have left her to die in the snow, who could have taken her children as prisoners or worse, had instead chosen to see her as she truly was, not as a representative of a race or a government, but as an individual human being deserving of compassion. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk the anger of your own people to help strangers?" Kamiakin's expression grew distant, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. 10 winters ago, my youngest brother was caught in a blizzard while hunting. He was found by a white trapper, a man named Niklowski, who could have left him to die or taken him prisoner. Instead, the trapper carried my brother to safety, shared his food and shelter, and asked for nothing in return. When the storm passed, he brought my brother back to our village and refused any reward. He paused, adding another log to the fire. My brother lived to become a great warrior, to marry and have children of his own. All because one white man chose to see him as a human being in need, rather than as an enemy to be destroyed. I learned that day that there is good and evil in all peoples, and that judging all by the actions of some is the path to endless war. The story hit Miriam with unexpected force. She thought of all the times she had heard settlers speak of Indians, as if they were all the same, all savage, all to be feared or destroyed. She realized that she had been guilty of the same kind of thinking, accepting without question the idea that all native peoples were her enemies. "I'm ashamed," she said quietly. "I believed the stories, the fear. I thought you were going to kill us when you first appeared." "Fear is natural," Kamiakin replied. "It keeps us alive in dangerous times. But wisdom is knowing when to set fear aside and listen to what the heart tells us." Singing Crow, who had been quietly tending to the babies, looked up and spoke in Yakama. Kamiakin listened, then nodded gravely. "She says the spirits brought you here for a reason," he translated. "That your presence in this sacred place is part of a larger plan that we do not yet understand. She says you and your children are under the protection of the ancestors now, and that anyone who harms you will answer to powers greater than any earthly chief." The words sent a shiver down Miriam's spine, not of fear but of something deeper and more profound. She looked around the ancient lodge, at the paintings on the walls that depicted generations of Yakama history, at the hot springs that had been providing warmth and healing for countless years, and she felt a connection to something larger than herself. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest," Kamiakin said firmly. "You heal, your children grow strong, and we wait for the spring to tell us what path to take. The spirits will guide us when the time is right." But even as he spoke, Miriam could see something in his eyes that suggested he was already thinking ahead, already calculating the challenges that lay before them. She was not naive enough to believe that their sanctuary in the sacred lodge could last forever. Eventually, the outside world would intrude, bringing with it all the prejudices and conflicts that had driven them to this place. For now, though, surrounded by warmth and kindness in a place that existed outside of time and politics, she was content to follow the chief's advice. She settled into the soft furs that Singing Crow had prepared for her, listening to the gentle bubbling of the hot springs and the soft breathing of her sleeping children Dot as she drifted toward sleep. Miriam thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 days ago, she had been a grieving widow fleeing through the snow with dying babies, convinced that the world was divided into clear categories of friend and enemy, us and them. Now she was the guest of a Yakama chief in a sacred lodge, her children wrapped in a war blanket that had seen countless battles, protected by an elderly woman whose wisdom seemed to flow from the very earth itself. The world, she realized, was far more complex and beautiful than she had ever imagined. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the snow-covered mountains, she would begin to discover just how much her understanding of everything was about to change. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the peaks, but inside the sacred lodge, all was warmth and peace. The war blanket lay folded carefully beside the sleeping babies, its intricate patterns seeming to glow in the firelight. And in that gentle glow, 3 very different people, a Yakama chief, his grandmother, and a white woman with her twin babies, began to forge bonds that would challenge everything their separate worlds believed about the nature of family, loyalty, and love. The peace of the sacred lodge shattered at dawn with the thunder of approaching horses. Miriam jerked awake from the first real sleep she'd had in days, her mother's instincts immediately alert to danger. Kamiakin was already on his feet, his hand resting on his tomahawk as he moved to the hidden entrance. The sound of voices carried Through the stone walls, angry voices speaking rapid Yakama, their tone unmistakably hostile. "What's happening?" Miriam whispered, instinctively moving toward her babies, who were still sleeping peacefully in their nest of furs. "War party," Kamiakin replied grimly. "They have been tracking us since yesterday. My nephew leads them, Red Hawk, son of my sister. He is young, angry, and has no patience for the old ways of hospitality." Singing Crow spoke sharply from across the lodge, her weathered hands never pausing in their work as she prepared morning medicine. Kamiakin listened, then nodded reluctantly. "She says we cannot hide any longer. They know we are here, and to refuse them entry to a sacred place would be an insult to the ancestors themselves. We must face them with honor." The entrance to the lodge swung open, and 6 Yakama warriors stormed inside, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. At their head walked a young man who could only be Red Hawk, tall and powerfully built like his uncle. But where Kamiakin's presence suggested controlled strength, Red Hawk radiated barely contained fury. His dark eyes swept the lodge until they found Miriam, and when they did, his lips pulled back in a snarl of disgust. "Uncle," he said in accented English, clearly wanting Miriam to understand every word, "I am told you have brought our enemies into the most sacred place of our people. I am told you have given them the protection of the war blanket. Please tell me these stories are lies." Kamiakin stepped between his nephew and Miriam, his stance casual but unmistakably protective. "The stories are true, Red Hawk. I found a mother and her dying children in the snow. I did what honor demanded." "Honor?" Red Hawk's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the stone walls. "You speak of honor while sheltering the spawn of those who murdered our brothers at Grande Ronde? While protecting the children of settlers who steal our salmon runs and hunt our elk to extinction?" He pointed an accusing finger at Miriam, who clutched her babies closer to her chest. "This woman's people have killed more Yakama warriors than smallpox and starvation combined. Her husband probably fought against us in the last war, and now you wrap his children in the blanket that has protected our chiefs for 7 generations?" The other warriors murmured agreement, their hands moving to their weapons. Miriam could see the rage in their eyes, the pain of losses that went far beyond anything she had experienced. These were men who had watched their world being systematically destroyed, their families killed, their sacred places desecrated. To them, she represented everything they had been fighting against, but Kamiakin stood his ground, his voice remaining calm despite the tension that filled the lodge like smoke. "I speak of the honor taught to us by our grandfathers," he said quietly. "The honor that says when you find someone dying in the snow, you do not ask what color their skin is before you decide whether to help them. I speak of the honor that recognizes courage wherever it is found, even in the heart of an enemy." "Courage?" Red Hawk spat. "I see only weakness. You have grown soft, uncle, listening too much to the whispers of old women and not enough to the cries of our young men who die fighting the white tide." Singing Crow rose from her place by the fire, her ancient eyes flashing with an anger that made even the warriors step back. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of 7 decades of life and the wisdom of generations before her. Though she spoke in Yakama, her meaning was clear enough from her tone and gestures. She was not pleased with her grandson's lack of respect. Kamiakin translated her words, his own voice carrying a warning edge. "She says you forget yourself, Red Hawk. She says you have become so consumed with hatred that you can no longer see the difference between justice and revenge. She reminds you that this is a sacred place where the spirits of our ancestors watch everything we do." "The spirits of our ancestors cry out for vengeance," Red Hawk shot back. "They demand payment for the blood that has been spilled, for the children who have starved because there are no more buffalo, for the women who have been violated by drunken soldiers." He turned to his warriors, seeking support. "Tell him, brothers. Tell him how the white settlers repay kindness with betrayal, how they signed treaties with one hand while reaching for their guns with the other. The warriors nodded, their faces grim with remembered pain. One of them, a scarred veteran with gray streaking his braids, stepped forward. "I am Swift Bear," he said in heavily accented English. "I was at Walla Walla when Governor Stevens promised us we could keep our ancestral lands if we signed his treaty. Within 1 year, white farmers were plowing our burial grounds, and soldiers were telling us to move to the reservation or be shot as hostiles." Another warrior, younger but bearing the marks of battle, added his voice. "I am Hawk's Wing. My sister was taken by miners who claimed she was trespassing on their claim, a claim that covered the stream where our people had fished for 1,000 years. We found her body 3 days later. The miners were never punished." One by one, the warriors told their stories, tales of broken promises, murdered families, sacred sites destroyed for timber or gold. Miriam listened with growing horror, realizing that her understanding of the conflict between settlers and tribes had been shaped by only one side of the story. These men had seen their entire world systematically dismantled, their people pushed to the edge of extinction, and they had every right to their anger. When the last warrior had spoken, Red Hawk turned back to his uncle with triumph in his eyes. "You see, Uncle, these are the people you would have us show mercy to. These are the children who will grow up to continue their parents' work of destroying everything we hold dear." But Kamiakin's expression hadn't changed. If anything, he seemed sadder but more resolved than before. "I have heard your stories, nephew, and they fill my heart with grief. Every death you describe is a wound that will never fully heal, every betrayal a scar on our people's soul. But tell me, does this woman look like Governor Stevens to you? Do her babies look like the miners who killed your sister, Swift Bear?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Miriam could see the warriors struggling with the logic of Kamiakin's words, their desire for revenge warring with their respect for their chief's wisdom. "She is one of them," Red Hawk said finally, but his voice lacked some of its earlier conviction. "Is she?" Kamiakin moved closer to Miriam, his presence somehow making her feel safer despite the dangerous tension in the room. "Look at her, nephew. Really look. What do you see?" Red Hawk's eyes moved reluctantly to Miriam, taking in her appearance with obvious distaste. But as the seconds passed, his expression began to change. He saw a woman who had clearly been through hell, her clothes torn and dirty, her face gaunt with exhaustion and grief, her hands bearing the calluses of someone who worked hard for everything she had. Most importantly, he saw the way she held her children, with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who would die before letting harm come to them. "I see a settler woman with half-breed spawn," he said, but the word sounded forced, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "You see what you have been taught to see," Kamiakin corrected gently. "But if you look with the eyes of a warrior instead of the eyes of hatred, you might see something different. You might see a woman who lost her husband to violence, who fled through a blizzard to save her children, who was willing to trust her life to strangers because her love for her babies was stronger than her fear." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You might see someone not so different from our own women, who have also lost husbands and fought to protect their children. You might see that courage and love are not limited by the color of one's skin." Singing Crow spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. This time, Kamiakin's translation was slower, more thoughtful. "She says the Spirit sent this woman to us for a reason we do not yet understand. She says that in the old times, when our people found orphaned children of enemy tribes, we raised them as our own because we knew that hatred could only be defeated by love. She asks if we have become so consumed by our anger that we have forgotten the wisdom of our ancestors." The old woman rose and walked to where Miriam sat with her babies. Without asking permission, she gently took Lucy from Miriam's arms and held her up for all the warriors to see. The baby, warm and healthy, now thanks to the care she had received, looked around the lodge with bright, curious eyes completely unafraid of the fierce-looking men who surrounded her. Singing Crow spoke again, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the stone chamber. Kamiakin translated, his own voice thick with emotion. She says, "Look at this child. She has no hatred in her heart, no prejudice in her eyes. She does not see enemies when she looks at us, she sees only people. Perhaps she is wiser than all of us." Lucy chose that moment to smile, a radiant expression of pure joy that transformed her tiny face. Several of the warriors shifted uncomfortably, as if the baby's innocence was somehow harder to face than armed enemies. Red Hawk stared at the child for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with emotions he couldn't quite name. When he spoke, his voice was quieter but still edged with pain. "And what happens when this innocent child grows up? What happens when she learns to hate us the way her people have taught their children to hate us for generations? What happens when she marries one of their men and raises her own children to see us as savages to be exterminated?" It was a fair question, and Miriam knew it. She had been raised with the same prejudices Red Hawk was describing, taught to fear and distrust the native peoples without ever questioning whether those teachings were based on truth or convenience. How could she promise that her children would be different? But as she looked at Lucy in Singing Crow's arms, at Samuel sleeping peacefully despite the anger and tension that filled the room, she felt something crystallize in her heart. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I was raised to think of your people as enemies. I was told stories about savage Indians who killed innocent settlers who couldn't be trusted or reasoned with. I believed those stories because they made it easier to justify taking your lands, killing your buffalo, breaking your treaties." The warriors listened in surprise, clearly not expecting such honesty from someone they considered an enemy. "But 3 days ago, when my babies were dying in the snow, it wasn't one of my own people who saved them. It was your chief, a man I had been taught to fear, who risked his own safety to wrap my children in his most sacred possession. It was your grandmother who used her healing knowledge to nurse them back to health. It was your people who showed mercy when they had every reason to show none." She looked around the lodge, meeting each warrior's eyes in turn. "My children will grow up knowing this story. They will know that when their mother was lost and desperate, it was the Yakama who saved them. They will know that hatred is a choice, not a birthright, and that there is good and evil in all peoples." Red Hawk's expression had grown thoughtful, but he wasn't ready to surrender his position. "Pretty words," he said. "But words are wind. How do we know you will not simply return to your own people and tell them lies about us, or worse, bring soldiers back to attack us for kidnapping you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, because everyone in the lodge knew it was a real possibility. The territorial authorities would not look kindly on a white woman and her children being held by Indians, regardless of the circumstances. Any rescue attempt would likely end in bloodshed. "Because I'm not going back," Miriam said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the babies seemed to sense the importance of the moment and remained perfectly still. "What did you say?" Red Hawk asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I said I'm not going back," Miriam repeated, more firmly this time. "Back to what? My husband is dead, my home is destroyed, and I have no family left in the territory. What's waiting for me in the white settlements? Charity? Pity? A life spent as a burden on people who will always see me as the widow who couldn't manage on her own." She stood still, holding Samuel, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Or worse, they'll expect me to remarry some man I don't love just so he can claim my children as his own and raise them to be good little Indian fighters. They'll want my babies to grow up hating the people who saved their lives." Kamiakin was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but she thought she saw approval in his dark eyes. "Here, in this sacred place, I've seen what real honor looks like," she continued. "I've seen what it means to choose compassion over revenge, wisdom over hatred. If your people will have us, if the spirits truly did bring us here for a reason, then this is where I want my children to grow up." Red Hawk stared at her as if she had sprouted wings. "You would stay? Live among us as one of us?" "I would try," Miriam said simply. "I know I have much to learn, and I know that earning your trust will take time. But I've seen enough of what hatred breeds. I want my children to grow up in a world where people like your uncle exist. People who are strong enough to show mercy, wise enough to see past the surface of things, courageous enough to do what's right, even when it's difficult." The warriors exchanged glances, clearly not knowing how to respond to such an unexpected declaration. This was not how they had expected this confrontation to go. Singing Crow spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. Kamiakin listened, then nodded slowly. "She says the circle closes," he translated. "She says that long ago, the spirits showed her a vision of this day, a white woman and her children coming to us in their darkest hour, and through them, a bridge being built between our peoples. She says it is not for us to question the will of the spirits, only to follow where they lead." Red Hawk looked around at his warriors, seeing the uncertainty in their faces. The righteous anger that had brought them here was ebbing, replaced by confusion and the uncomfortable realization that the world was not as simple as they had wanted to believe. "This is madness," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "You cannot simply adopt our enemies into the tribe. The other chiefs will never accept it. The other chiefs will follow my lead, as they always have," Kamiakin replied with quiet authority. "And if they do not, then we will call a great council and let all the people decide. But I believe that when they hear this story, when they see the courage this woman has shown, they will understand that sometimes the spirits work in ways we do not expect." He moved to stand beside Miriam, his presence lending her strength. "Besides, nephew, consider this. If she stays among us, if her children grow up as Yakama, then they will truly understand both worlds. They will be able to speak for us to their birth people, to help build the understanding that might prevent future wars." It was a compelling argument, and Miriam could see that it had given Red Hawk something to think about. The young warrior was clearly struggling with concepts that challenged everything he had believed about the nature of the conflict between Indians and whites. Finally, Swift Bear, the scarred veteran who had spoken earlier, stepped forward. "I have fought many battles," he said slowly. "I have killed many enemies and seen many friends die. But I have never seen an enemy voluntarily give up everything to live among us. Perhaps," he looked directly at Miriam, "the spirits truly do work in mysterious ways." One by one, the other warriors nodded agreement. Not enthusiastic acceptance, but a willingness to consider possibilities they had never imagined. Red Hawk was the last to speak, his young face grave with the weight of decisions that could affect his entire people. "I do not like this," he said. "Finally, every instinct tells me it is a trap, that somehow this will bring disaster upon us. But," he looked at his uncle with grudging respect, "you have led our people through many crises, and your wisdom has always proven true in the end. If you say the spirits have brought this woman to us, then I will not stand in the way of their will." He turned to Miriam, his eyes still hard but no longer actively hostile. "But know this, white woman. If you betray our trust, if you bring harm to our people through your presence here, I will personally ensure that you regret the day you ever heard the name Yakama." "I understand," Miriam replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I accept the responsibility that comes with the trust you're placing in me." Red Hawk nodded curtly, then turned to leave. As he reached the entrance, he paused and looked back. "The other tribes will hear of this," he warned. "Some will see it as weakness, others as betrayal of the old ways. There will be consequences, uncle. Make sure you are prepared to face them. And with that ominous prediction, he and his warriors departed, leaving the sacred lodge in a silence that felt heavy with the weight of irrevocable change. Miriam sank back down beside her babies, suddenly exhausted by the emotional intensity of the confrontation. Kamiakin sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "Are you certain about this choice?" he asked quietly. "The path ahead will not be easy. Many of my people will never fully accept you, and the white authorities will consider you a traitor to your own race." Miriam looked down at Lucy and Samuel, both sleeping peacefully despite the drama that had just unfolded around them. They looked so innocent, so full of potential. What kind of world did she want them to grow up in? "I'm certain," she said finally. "For the first time since Benjamin died, I'm completely certain about something. This is where we belong." Outside, the wind had died down, and shafts of sunlight were beginning to penetrate the clouds that had hidden the sky for days. The storm, it seemed, was finally passing. But Miriam had a feeling that the real challenges were just beginning. Spring came slowly to the Cascade Mountains, but when it arrived, it brought with it changes that would test every promise made in the sacred lodge. Miriam had spent the winter months learning the rhythms of Yakama life, studying their language with the patience of someone who understood that words were the bridge between worlds. Singing Crow had become her constant teacher, showing her how to prepare traditional foods, weave baskets from river reeds, and read the subtle signs that foretold changes in weather and season. The twins had thrived in ways that amazed everyone who saw them. Lucy had begun walking early, toddling through the lodge with the fearless curiosity of a child who had never known anything but love and acceptance. Samuel, though quieter than his sister, showed signs of unusual intelligence, watching everything with thoughtful eyes that seemed to understand far more than his young age should allow. Both children were bilingual now, chattering happily in Yakama as easily as they babbled in English. But as the snow melted and the passes opened, the isolation that had protected them began to crumble. Word of Kamiakin's unprecedented decision had spread throughout the territory like wildfire, reaching every tribe, every settlement, every military outpost between the Columbia River and the Canadian border. The reactions were as varied as they were intense. The first test came from an unexpected source. A delegation of Cayuse warriors arrived at the main Yakama village on a morning when the air still held winter's bite, but spring flowers were pushing through the last patches of snow. They were led by a chief named Iron Bear, a man whose reputation for fierceness was matched only by his contempt for anything having to do with white settlers. Miriam was working with a group of Yakama women, learning to tan a deer hide under their patient instruction. When the war cries echoed across the valley, the women immediately began gathering their children, their faces tight with worry. This was not a friendly visit. "Stay here," one of the women, a young mother named Bright Moon, whispered to Miriam in accented English. "Do not let them see you or the babies." But it was too late. Iron Bear had not come to conduct his business in private. He rode directly to the lodge where Miriam was staying. His 20 warriors spread out behind him in a formation that spoke of barely controlled violence. When he dismounted, his weathered face was set in lines of disgust and betrayal. "Kamiakin," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Show yourself. Show me this white woman who has bewitched our greatest chief into forgetting his duty to his people." Kamiakin emerged from his own lodge, his expression calm but alert. Behind him came several of his most trusted warriors, including Red Hawk, whose hand rested casually on his tomahawk handle. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Iron Bear," Kamiakin said formally, his voice carrying the respect due to a fellow chief, but nothing more. "You are welcome in our village. What brings the mighty Cayuse so far from their own lands?" "You know what brings me," Iron Bear spat, his eyes searching the area until they found Miriam. When he saw her, his expression twisted with such hatred that she instinctively stepped back, clutching Lucy and Samuel closer to her chest. "I come because I cannot believe the stories that have reached my ears. I come because I refuse to accept that the great Kamiakin, the chief who has led our people in their darkest hour, has become a traitor to everything we have fought and died for." The word traitor hung in the air like poison. Several of Kamiakin's warriors shifted restlessly, their loyalty to their chief warring with the respect they owed to visiting tribal leaders. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that could tear apart the fragile alliances that held the native peoples together against the white invasion. "Speak your mind plainly, Iron Bear," Kamiakin replied, his voice still level but with an edge that suggested his patience was not infinite. "Say what you have come to say." Iron Bear pointed directly at Miriam, his finger trembling with rage. "That woman is the daughter of our enemies. Her people have murdered our children, stolen our lands, broken every promise they have ever made to us. And you treat her as family. You protect her children as if they were your own blood." He began to pace, his anger building with each word. "Do you know what the other tribes are saying, Kamiakin? They are saying that the great chief of the Yakama has grown weak, that he has been seduced by white flesh and forgotten the blood of his own people. They are saying that perhaps it is time for new leadership that remembers who our enemies truly are." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Miriam could see the shock on the faces of Kamiakin's people, the way the words seemed to wound them more deeply than any weapon could. For a proud people who had fought so hard to maintain their independence, the suggestion that their chief had been compromised was almost unbearable. But Kamiakin's expression never changed. If anything, he seemed to grow calmer as Iron Bear's rage mounted. "Are you finished?" he asked quietly. "No." Iron Bear shouted, "I am not finished. I demand that you cast out this white witch and her spawn. I demand that you remember your duty to your people and stop this madness before it destroys everything we have built." He turned to address the growing crowd of Yakama villagers who had been drawn by the commotion. "Look at yourselves. Look how you have allowed this contamination to spread. I see some of you treating this woman as if she belongs among you, as if her children have the right to learn our sacred ways." The crowd stirred uneasily. Miriam could see the conflict in their faces. Some showed anger at Iron Bear's words, but others were nodding agreement. The doubts that had been simmering beneath the surface all winter were being brought into the harsh light of day. Iron Bear sensed his advantage and pressed on. "What happens when the soldiers come looking for her? What happens when they discover that the mighty Yakama are harboring white captives? They will use it as an excuse to attack us all, to break the treaties and drive us onto the reservations like cattle." The fear in his voice was real, and Miriam realized with growing horror that he might be right. Her presence here, her decision to stay among the Yakama, could indeed provide the territorial authorities with the justification they needed to launch a full-scale war against the tribes. "You speak of fear disguised as wisdom," Kamiakin said finally, his voice cutting through Iron Bear's tirade like a blade. "You speak of enemies and friends as if the world were divided into neat lines that never change. But tell me, Iron Bear, when did the Cayuse become so afraid of their own shadows that they would punish mercy and condemn compassion?" Iron Bear's face flushed with rage. "I am not afraid of anything, least of all the consequences of doing what is right." "Then prove it," Kamiakin said simply. The challenge hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that everyone present understood. Iron Bear had essentially accused Kamiakin of cowardice and betrayal in front of both their peoples. By the ancient laws that governed relations between tribes, only one response was possible. "I challenge your judgment, Kamiakin," Iron Bear said formally, his voice carrying the weight of ritual. "I call upon the ancient ways to determine the truth. Let the spirits decide whether mercy or justice should rule this day." Miriam's blood ran cold. She didn't fully understand the implications of what was happening, but she could see the grim expressions on the faces around her. Whatever Iron Bear was proposing, it was deadly serious. Singing Crow appeared at Kamiakin's side her, aged face grave. She spoke quickly in Yakama, her tone urgent. Kamiakin listened, then nodded slowly. "She reminds me of the old laws," he said to Iron Bear. "If you challenge my judgment, you must be prepared to face the consequences of being wrong. The trial by fire shows no mercy to those who call upon it falsely." "I am prepared," Iron Bear replied without hesitation. "Are you?" The trial by fire was something from the old days, a ritual so ancient that most people knew it only as legend. But as the two chiefs spoke rapidly in their native tongue, making the formal arrangements, Miriam began to understand the terrible reality of what was about to happen. Two men would enter a specially constructed lodge filled with burning coals and sacred smoke. They would remain inside until one of them could no longer endure the heat and emerge defeated. The man who lasted longest would be judged by the spirits to be speaking the truth. The loser would be forever shamed, his judgment questioned, his authority diminished, but there was more to it than simple endurance. The ritual was also a spiritual test, a way for the spirits to judge not just physical strength, but the purity of one's intentions. Many men had died in trial by fire, consumed by flames that somehow knew the difference between truth and falsehood. "There must be another way," Miriam said desperately, approaching Kamiakin as the preparations began. "This is madness. I won't let you risk your life because of me." Kamiakin turned to her, his expression gentle but implacable. "This is not about you, Miriam Stone. This is about the kind of people we choose to be." Iron Bear represents the old way of thinking, the way that says strength can only come from hatred and fear. I represent the belief that true strength comes from wisdom and compassion. But if I lose, then perhaps Iron Bear is right, and the spirits are telling us that mercy has no place in a world at war. His eyes were sad but determined. But I do not believe that is what they will say. The trial lodge was constructed with frightening efficiency. Warriors from both tribes worked together to build a dome-shaped structure from green branches and hides, leaving only a small entrance that could be sealed from the outside. Inside, a fire pit was prepared and filled with special woods that would burn intensely hot and produce the sacred smoke that was said to carry prayers directly to the spirit world. As the sun reached its zenith, the two chiefs prepared for the ordeal. They stripped to simple loincloths and submitted to ritual purification by the shamans of both tribes. Iron Bear's body was painted with symbols of war and vengeance, while Kamiakin bore the marks of wisdom and protection. The entire village gathered to witness the trial, their faces grave with the knowledge that whatever happened in that lodge would change everything. Red Hawk stood with his uncle's warriors, his young face torn between loyalty and doubt. If Kamiakin died or was defeated, the leadership of the Yakama would fall to him, and he would have to decide whether to honor his uncle's promises or bow to the pressure of other tribes. Miriam stood with Singing Crow and the other women, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware that their entire future was about to be decided by an ancient ritual that predated the arrival of white men by centuries. She watched as the fire was lit and the lodge began to fill with smoke, knowing that she was witnessing something that few white people had ever seen. "Why?" she whispered to Singing Crow. "Why would he risk everything for us?" The old woman's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "Because some things are worth more than life," she said in careful English. "Because a chief who will not stand for what he believes is no chief at all." The two men entered the lodge together, and the entrance was sealed behind them. The only sound was the crackle of flames and the low chanting of the shamans, calling upon the spirits to witness and judge. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the crowd waited in silence, knowing that inside the lodge, two men were enduring unimaginable. Heat and pain for the right to determine the future of their peoples. Minutes passed like hours. The lodge glowed with internal fire, and occasionally sounds could be heard from within, gasps of pain, muttered prayers, the shuffle of movement as the men shifted position to avoid the worst of the heat. Several times the crowd thought they heard someone calling out, but the words were lost in the roar of flames and the thickness of smoke. Then, suddenly, there was a loud cry and the sound of someone falling. The entrance to the lodge burst open, and Iron Bear stumbled out, his body covered in burns, his face blackened with smoke. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, clearly unable to continue. But where was Kamiakin? For a terrifying moment, the crowd feared the worst. Had the Yakama chief died in the flames, leaving his people leaderless and his promises unfulfilled? Red Hawk started forward, ready to enter the lodge himself to find his uncle, but singing. Crow caught his arm. "Wait," she said simply. "Listen." From inside the lodge came a sound that made everyone's blood run cold, the sound of someone singing. Not screaming, not crying out in pain, but singing one of the old songs, a chant of victory and spiritual power that their grandfathers had sung when they returned from successful hunts and glorious battles. The singing grew stronger, clearer, and finally Kamiakin emerged from the lodge. His body bore the marks of the ordeal, burns on his arms and legs, his hair singed, his face streaked with soot, but he walked upright, his eyes clear and victorious. In his hands, he carried something that made the crowd gasp in amazement. It was a coal from the sacred fire, a burning ember that should have been impossible for any man to hold with bare flesh. But Kamiakin carried it as easily as if it were a flower, the flames dancing around his fingers without causing him any apparent pain. "The spirits have spoken," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "They have judged between fear and wisdom, between hatred and love. They have chosen compassion." He walked to where Iron Bear knelt, still gasping from his ordeal, and gently helped the defeated chief to his feet. There was no triumph in his manner, no gloating over his victory. Instead, there's only the quiet dignity of a man who had been vindicated, but took no pleasure in another's suffering. "Brother," he said to Iron Bear, using the formal address of respect between chiefs, "you fought bravely and with honor. Your concern for our people comes from love, even if that love has been twisted by pain and fear. There is no shame in your defeat, only in the hatred that drove you to this place." Iron Bear looked at him with eyes that were no longer filled with rage, but with something approaching awe. The trial by fire was said to strip away all pretense, to reveal the true nature of a man's soul. What he had seen in that lodge, what the spirits had shown him about Kamiakin's character, had shaken him to his core. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "The spirits have shown me that my heart was clouded by anger, that I could no longer see the difference between justice and revenge. Forgive me, brother." Kamiakin nodded gravely, then turned to address the combined crowd of Yakama and Cayuse warriors. "Let all witness what has happened here today. The spirits have confirmed that mercy is not weakness, that showing compassion to former enemies is not betrayal of our own people. The white woman and her children are under the protection of the sacred fire itself. Any who harm them will answer, not just to me, but to the ancestors themselves." The crowd began to disperse, the tension broken, the crisis resolved. But as Miriam watched Iron Bear and his warriors prepare to leave, she noticed something that filled her with hope. Several of the Cayuse warriors approached her, not with hostility but with curiosity. They spoke briefly with some of the Yakama women, asking questions about her, about the children, about her decision to stay among them. One young Cayuse warrior, barely more than a boy, shyly approached Lucy, who was toddling around the lodge entrance. When she smiled at him and babbled something in Yakama, His stern expression melted into wonder. Here was a white child who spoke his language, who showed no fear of his painted face and fearsome weapons. "Perhaps," Iron Bear said quietly to Kamiakin. As he prepared to mount his horse, "The spirits see farther than we do. Perhaps they know things that we, in our pain and anger, have forgotten." "Perhaps," Kamiakin agreed. "But it will take time for such wisdom to spread. There will be other challenges, other tests." Iron Bear nodded grimly. "The territorial governor will not be pleased when he learns what has happened here. Stevens has been looking for an excuse to break the treaties and force all tribes onto reservations. A white woman living among the Yakama might be exactly the justification he needs." The warning was prophetic. Even as Iron Bear and his warriors rode away, carrying word of Kamiakin's victory to every tribe in the territory, other forces were already in motion. A cavalry patrol had been dispatched from Fort Walla with orders to investigate reports of white captives being held by hostile Indians. Their commander, Colonel Marcus Whitman, was a man who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and he had no patience for the subtleties of tribal politics or the complexities of voluntary captivity. Within days, smoke signals began appearing on distant peaks, carrying messages that spoke of approaching danger. The network of communication that connected all the tribes of the Pacific Northwest was buzzing with warnings and preparations. The trial by fire had settled the question of Miriam's place among the Yakama, but it had also made her presence impossible. To hide Dot as she stood outside the lodge that evening, watching her children play with the other village youngsters, Miriam realized that the true test was just beginning. The spiritual battle had been won, but the physical one was approaching fast. Soon, very soon, she would have to choose between the safety of the people who had accepted her and the demands of the world she had left behind. The war blanket that had saved her children's lives lay folded carefully inside the lodge, its sacred pattern seeming to glow in the firelight. Tomorrow, she knew, she might need its protection once again, not from the cold of winter storms, but from the heat of conflict that was racing toward them like wildfire across the mountains. The cavalry arrived at dawn, their blue uniforms stark against the green of early summer. Colonel Marcus Whitman rode at the head of 40 soldiers, his weathered face set in grim determination as he surveyed the Yakama village through his field glasses. Behind him, his men checked their weapons and adjusted their positions, forming a loose circle around the settlement that spoke of military precision and hostile intent. Miriam stood at the entrance to Kamiakin's lodge, her heart pounding as she watched the soldiers take their positions. Lucy and Samuel, now toddling confidently around the village, were safely inside with Singing Crow, but she could hear their confused voices asking why the women were crying, why the men were reaching for their weapons. "Mrs. Stone." Colonel Whitman's voice boomed across the village, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "I am Colonel Marcus Whitman of the United States Army. I have come to escort you and your children to safety. Step forward and identify yourself." The formal demand hung in the morning air like a death sentence. Miriam could feel the eyes of the entire village upon her, could sense the tension that thrummed through every warrior who stood ready to defend their home. This was the moment she had dreaded, the confrontation that would force her to choose between the world she had left behind and the life she had built among the Yakama. Kamiakin emerged from his lodge, his face calm but his hand resting on his tomahawk. He wore the full regalia of his office, the war bonnet that had been passed down through 7 generations of chiefs, the elk-hide shirt decorated with the scalps of enemies defeated in honorable combat, the sacred bear-claw necklace that marked him as a man who had spoken with the spirits themselves. "I am Kamiakin, chief of the Yakama people," he called back, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "The woman you seek is under my protection. She is here by her own choice, not as a captive, but as a member of our family." Whitman's laugh was harsh and dismissive. Chief, I don't know what lies this woman has told you, but I have my orders. Mrs. Stone and her children are coming with me, one way or another. Stand aside, and no one needs to get hurt. The threat was clear, but so was the colonel's ignorance of the situation he had walked into. Miriam could see the fury building in the faces of the Yakama warriors, could feel the electric tension that preceded violence. One wrong word, one aggressive move, and this peaceful village would become a battlefield. Colonel Whitman, she called out, stepping forward so that he could see her clearly. I am Miriam Stone, and I need you to listen to me very carefully. The officer's eyes fixed on her, taking in her appearance with obvious disapproval. She wore traditional Yakama clothing, now a dress of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork, her hair braided with the feathers and shells that marked her as a respected member of the tribe. To his military mind, she looked like a white woman who had gone native, a betrayal of everything civilized and proper. Mrs. Stone, you've obviously been through a terrible ordeal, he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that men used when they believed women were incapable of making rational decisions. But you're safe now. I'm here to take you and your children back to civilization, where you belong. I am exactly where I belong, Miriam replied, her voice steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach. Colonel, I was dying in a blizzard when Chief Kamiakan found me. My children were freezing to death, and he saved us all. I chose to stay here because these people showed me kindness when I needed it most. Whitman's expression hardened. Ma'am, with all due respect, you're not thinking clearly. You've been held captive by hostiles for months. It's natural that you might develop feelings of dependency, even gratitude, toward your captors. But these are not your people, and this is not your life. The words hit like physical blows, dismissing everything she had experienced, everything she had learned, everything she had become. Miriam felt her temper flare, but she forced herself to remain calm. Losing control now would only make things worse. Colonel, I am not a captive. I am not suffering from any kind of mental disturbance. I am a grown woman who has made a conscious choice about how to live my life and raise my children. I am asking you to respect that choice and leave us in peace. But Whitman was already shaking his head. I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am. You see, there are larger issues at stake here. The territorial government needs to know that white women and children are safe from Indian depredations. Your presence here, willing or not, could be seen as evidence that our treaties aren't being honored. The political calculation was clear. And Miriam realized with growing horror that her individual choice was being swept aside by forces far larger than herself. To men like Whitman, she wasn't a person with rights and desires. She was a symbol, a piece in a game of territorial expansion and racial conflict. In other words, she said quietly, you don't care what I want. You're taking me whether I agree or not. I'm taking you because it's my duty to protect American citizens, Whitman replied, even when they don't understand what's best for them. The exchange had been heard by everyone in the village, translated quickly by those who understood English. The reaction was immediate and electric. Warriors began moving to flanking positions, their weapons appearing as if from nowhere. Women started evacuating children to the far end of the village, while elders began chanting prayers for protection and victory. Kamiakan stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. Colonel, the woman has spoken her mind clearly. She chooses to remain among us. Will you respect her choice, or will you use force to take her against her will? I will do my duty as I see fit, Whitman replied, his own hand moving to his sidearm. This conversation is over. Mrs. Stone, gather your children and come forward. That's an order. The moment hung suspended like a drop of water on the edge of a cliff. Miriam could feel the weight of decision pressing down upon her, could sense that whatever she did next would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone in the village. If she refused to go, Whitman would attack and people would die. If she agreed, she would be abandoning the people who had saved her life and accepted her as family. Then Lucy's voice carried across the tense silence, a pure sound of childish joy that cut through the adult tensions like a blade. The little girl had escaped from the lodge and was toddling toward her mother, babbling happily in Yakama as she pointed at the pretty horses and the men in their blue uniforms. Whitman stared at the child in shock. "My God," he whispered, "she's speaking their heathen language." "She's speaking the language of the people who saved her life," Miriam replied fiercely. "The language of the grandmother who nursed her back to health. The language of the children who play with her every day." But she could see the horror in the colonel's eyes, the way he looked at Lucy as if she were some kind of contaminated creature. To him, a white child who spoke Indian languages was an abomination, evidence of corrupted innocence that needed to be cleansed and corrected. "This is worse than I thought," he said grimly. "Those children have been thoroughly contaminated by savage influence. They'll need months of proper education to undo the damage." The casual cruelty of his words broke something inside Miriam. These people had saved her children's lives, had loved them, and cared for them as if they were their own blood. And this man wanted to tear them away from everything they knew, to punish them for the crime of being loved by the wrong people. "No," she said simply. "I beg your pardon?" I said no. Miriam's voice grew stronger with each word. "I will not let you take my children away from their family. I will not let you destroy the bonds they have formed with people who have shown them nothing but kindness. And I will not let you turn this village into a battlefield because you're too ignorant to understand that love comes in many forms." She turned to face Kamiakin, speaking in careful Yakama so that everyone could understand. "My chief, my family, I choose to stay. Whatever comes, whatever the consequences, I choose to stand with my people." The effect was immediate and profound. The Yakama warriors straightened with pride, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. Singing Crow emerged from the lodge carrying Samuel, tears streaming down her weathered face as she heard Miriam's declaration. Even Red Hawk, who had been so skeptical of her presence, nodded with something approaching respect, but Whitman's reaction was explosively violent. "You stupid woman, do you have any idea what you've done? You've just signed the death warrant for every person in this village." He raised his hand, and his soldiers began moving forward, their rifles at the ready. The Yakama warriors responded. Instantly, arrows appearing on bowstrings, tomahawks gleaming in the morning light. The peaceful village was about to become a killing ground. Then Kamiakin did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. He walked directly toward the line of soldiers, his arms spread wide, his chest exposed to their weapons. It was an act of such breathtaking courage that even the hardened cavalry troopers hesitated. "If you want to kill innocents," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "then kill me first. I am the one who saved the woman and her children. I am the one who offered them sanctuary. I am the one who chose mercy over hatred." He stopped just out of arm's reach of the soldiers, his dark eyes meeting Whitman's pale ones. "But know this, Colonel. If you fire the first shot, if you bring violence to this place of peace, then you will be the one who breaks the sacred laws of hospitality. You will be the one who murders children and elders for the crime of showing kindness to strangers." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Whitman's finger was on the trigger of his pistol, but something in Kamiakin's eyes made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity of the chief's courage, or perhaps it was the growing realization that attacking a peaceful village would create a scandal that could destroy his career. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice shaking with frustrated rage. "The territorial government will hear about this. There will be consequences for harboring white captives, no matter how willing they claim to be." "Then let the consequences come," Kamiakin replied calmly. "We have faced them before, and we will face them again. But we will not abandon our principles for the sake of political convenience." Whitman holstered his weapon and turned to his men. "Mount up, we're returning to the fort." As the soldiers wheeled their horses and rode away, the tension in the village slowly began to ease. But Miriam knew that the colonel's parting words had been more than just a threat. They had been a promise. The territorial authorities would not let this challenge to their authority go unanswered. That evening, as the village celebrated their bloodless victory, Miriam sat with Kamiakin beside the sacred fire. Lucy and Samuel played at their feet, chattering happily in both languages, completely unaware of how close they had come to being torn away from the only family they had ever really known. "What will happen now?" she asked quietly. Kamiakin's expression was thoughtful as he stared into the flames. "Now we prepare for the real war," he said simply. Today was just the beginning. But as Miriam watched her children play, surrounded by the people who had saved their lives and accepted them as family, she felt no regret for the choice she had made. Some things she had learned were worth fighting for, and some families were worth dying for, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. The war blanket lay folded beside them, its sacred patterns seeming to pulse with inner fire. Soon, very soon, they might need its protection again. But for now, in this moment of peace before the storm, they were together, and that was enough. 5 years had passed since the day Colonel Whitman rode away in defeat, and the war he had promised never came. Not because the territorial government had given up their plans, but because something unexpected had happened in the aftermath of that tense confrontation. Word of Miriam's choice, of Kamiakin's courage, and of a white woman willingly raising her children as Yakama had spread far beyond the boundaries of Washington territory. The story reached newspapers in San Francisco, Chicago, and even New York, where it was seized upon by abolitionists and progressive thinkers as proof that racial harmony was possible. Eastern philanthropists began pressuring the government to study this remarkable experiment in cross-cultural adoption rather than destroy it. Politicians who had been eager for Indian wars suddenly found themselves defending peace as the more enlightened policy. Miriam stood at the edge of the village, watching Lucy and Samuel race their Yakama friends to the river for their morning swim. At 6 years old, the twins were indistinguishable from their playmates except for their lighter skin and hair. They moved with the easy confidence of children who had never known prejudice, switching between English and Yakama as naturally as breathing, equally at home with traditional stories and settler tales. "Grandmother Crow says we're going to the salmon ceremony tomorrow," Lucy announced breathlessly as she ran up to Miriam, her blonde braids decorated with the same feathers and beads as her Yakama sisters. "She says we get to help with the first catch blessing. Can I carry the sacred pipe?" Samuel added eagerly, his serious nature evident even in his excitement. "Red Hawk promised to teach me the proper words." Miriam smiled, remembering when she had first feared these very traditions, seeing them as heathen practices that would corrupt her children. Now she understood that they were teaching Lucy and Samuel values that many white children never learned: respect for nature, reverence for their elders, and the understanding that all life was connected in sacred ways. "Of course you can participate," she told them. "But remember what Grandfather Kamiakin taught you about ceremonies. They're not games," both children recited dutifully. "They're prayers made visible, and we must approach them with pure hearts." As the twins ran back to their friends, Miriam reflected on how much had changed since that desperate winter night when Kamiakin had first wrapped them in his war blanket. The blanket itself now hung in a place of honor in their lodge, its sacred patterns having been copied into beadwork that decorated both children's ceremonial clothing. It had become a symbol not just of survival, but of the bridge that could exist between different worlds. Singing Crow approached from the village, moving more slowly now but still sharp as winter wind. At 82, she had become something of a legend herself, the wise woman who had helped raise white children as true Yakama while never letting them forget their birth heritage. "The messengers have returned," she said quietly in Yakama, her weathered hand touching Miriam's arm. "The Great Council has made their decision." Miriam's heart quickened. For months, representatives from all the major tribes had been meeting to discuss the changing relationship with the territorial government. New treaties were being negotiated, and the question of mixed families, white and Indian, people living together by choice, had become a central issue. Kamiakan emerged from the council lodge, his face grave but not defeated. Now in his 50s, he carried the dignity of a leader who had guided his people through their darkest period without losing his essential humanity. The silver in his hair caught the morning light as he approached them. "They have agreed," he said simply. "The new treaty will include provisions for voluntary adoption across tribal boundaries. Families like ours will be recognized and protected under both tribal and territorial law." The words hit Miriam like a physical force. After years of existing in legal limbo, constantly threatened by the possibility of forced separation, they would finally be safe. More than that, they would be pioneers of a new kind of family, one that proved love could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided people. "What changed their minds?" Miriam asked. Kamiakan's smile was tired, but genuine. "Your children changed their minds. Lucy and Samuel have become living proof that white and Indian people can live together without losing what makes them who they are. They speak both languages, honor both traditions, and show respect for all people regardless of color." He paused, watching as Samuel helped a younger Yakama boy who had fallen while running. The territorial representatives saw this during the negotiations. They saw children who were clearly white, but who had learned Yakama values of generosity, courage, and wisdom. They realized that perhaps there were things their own children could learn from our ways. A new sound caught their attention, the approach of wagons from the east. But these were not military vehicles or hostile settlers. Instead, they carried families, carefully screened volunteers who had asked permission to settle near the Yakama village and learn from their agricultural techniques and environmental wisdom. The territorial government, faced with growing pressure from Eastern reformers and the undeniable success of Miriam's integration, had reluctantly agreed to a radical experiment. Selected white families would be allowed to settle in designated areas near tribal lands, with the understanding that their families' children would be educated in both cultures, and that disputes would be resolved by joint councils rather than military force. "It won't be easy," Kamiakan warned as they watched the newcomers make camp. "There will be those on both sides who resist this change, who prefer the old ways of separation and suspicion. But perhaps, if we can show them that different peoples can live together with mutual respect." He didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew that what they had built here, this family that transcended racial boundaries, this community that proved cooperation was possible, could be the foundation for something much larger. That evening, as the village celebrated the news of the treaty and welcomed the new settlers, Miriam found herself standing once again beside the sacred fire that had witnessed so many important moments in their journey. Lucy and Samuel sat nearby, working on a beadwork project with Singing Crow, their small fingers carefully threading the intricate patterns that told the story of their unusual family. Red Hawk, now a respected war leader in his own right, approached with his own children, twin boys who had become best friends with Lucy and Samuel. The former skeptic had become one of the strongest supporters of the integration experiment, often saying that the white woman's children had taught his own sons that courage came in many forms. "Aunt Miriam," he said formally, using the title of respect that marked her full acceptance into the family structure, "I wanted you to know that I will be leading the delegation to the territorial capital next month. We will be presenting our model to other regions, showing them how voluntary integration can work." The title, Aunt, carried special significance in Yakama culture, indicating not just affection, but responsibility for the tribe's future. Miriam had earned it not through blood, but through her consistent choices to put the community's welfare ahead of her own comfort. "I'm honored by your trust," she replied. "But remember that the real credit belongs to the children. They're the ones who proved it was possible." As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy looked up from her beadwork, her blue eyes bright with excitement. "Mama, Samuel and I have been talking with the other children. We want to write letters to kids in other places, tell them about our life here. Maybe if they understand that we're happy, that we're still who we are, but also something new, ... Samuel nodded solemnly. "Red Hawk's boys want to learn English better, and the new settler children want to learn Yakama. We could teach each other, show everyone that you can be proud of where you come from and still be excited about where you're going." Miriam felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that her children, barely 6 years old, had instinctively understood something that adults often missed. They weren't choosing between identities. They were creating new ones that honored all parts of themselves. As the fire burned lower and families began returning to their lodges, Miriam wrapped the war blanket around her shoulders one final time. Its sacred pattern seemed to glow in the dying light, and she could almost feel the presence of all the chiefs who had worn it before, all the battles it had witnessed, all the courage it had inspired. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they worked to expand their model of integration to other communities. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments when the old hatreds threatened to destroy everything they had built. But tonight, surrounded by the family that had chosen her as much as she had chosen them, Miriam Stone felt something she had never experienced in her old life. She felt complete. The twins fell asleep that night as they always did, curled up together in the nest of furs that Singing Crow had first prepared for them years ago. But now the nest was bigger, filled with children of different colors and backgrounds, all sleeping peacefully under the protection of the war blanket that had once saved 2 freezing babies and had ended up saving so much more. Outside, the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not in hunger or loneliness, but in simple acknowledgement of the night's beauty. The sound was answered by another wolf, then another, until the entire valley rang with their ancient song. It was the sound of family calling to family, of different voices joining together to create something larger than any could achieve alone. And in the growing darkness, it sounded very much like hope.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.